The Bank of Sevilla was square in shape, 250 meters long to a side, each 25 meters deep. Its 9 stories rose up 40 meters high, with room for thousands of offices and several dozen meeting rooms. From the outside, the building resembled a fortress, with rows of tinted glass windows arranged like arrow slits along its gently sloped ramparts, and a stone parapet adorning the perimeter like a crown. Its facade was off-white, with dark crimson and gold trim. Despite its name, no flag belonging to any nation or union hung from its outer walls, or stood atop a mast on its grounds, for none could lay claim to it. A flag did fly there, however, its own flag. The building's official name, its proper name, was the Bank of International Settlement and Securitization, wherein all the accounts of all the nations and unions of the world were cleared, and to whom untold swaths of money were loaned out according to the wishes and whims of its owners, financing the engineering of society in pursuit of their own world view. Its present domicile was the intersection between Lesath Road and Shala Drive, in an area of Calcatrix known by locals as the Scorpion's Tail. The treasury of the Confederated States of Sevilla had become insolvent the first year after the Union was formed, going into debt almost immediately, and before the ink in its charter had even dried. Later, it had officially, albeit quietly, declared bankruptcy following the end of the several wars. The treasury was then subsequently assumed by the Bank of Sevilla and made subject to its jurisdiction, with the Secretary of Treasury acting as the bank's public face, and the Treasury Department thereafter serving as the primary enforcement arm of the debt the Confederacy citizens owed to various international creditors and bondholders. Such lenders included various state actors, juristic persons, and even a number of wealthy individuals, many of whom had more than a passing interest in globalization and the establishment of a borderless world, a new international order. Within the bank's central courtyard, a domed structure spiraled up from the ground like a 50-meter-high conch shell before doubling back in on itself, tapering towards the epicenter of the complex, funneling down in a swirling vortex of steel. The solid black metal mesh continued underground several stories, providing a single shaft of light down to the darkened chamber of the chthonic creature that slumbered beneath the Scorpion's Tail, the being known as Bureaucracy. Her nesting ground lay bare for all to see within plain view, and yet she herself remained an enigma, her existence known only to a wary and privileged few. Her reach was long, her influence considerable, stretching to the 4 corners of the earth. She had her hands in nearly everything of importance within the realm of human affairs, and yet she always remained unsatisfied, ever hungering for still more control over the confines of mankind, desiring to entangle them further within her cage of red-taped socialism. Through her, the entire world became a vast network of interconnectivity, a most vexing trap of compartmentalization and compliance, an utterly unnavigable twisting labyrinth of standards and practices, of forms and regulations, through which everything must necessarily pass on the road to legitimacy, all done in the name of protecting the public from itself, of course. By her will were the kings of old made, and the present presidents and senators whose quaint and noble-sounding policies all sought her seal of approval and stamp of validation, but which would ultimately bend the knee to her in the end, or risk obscurity. Any who deviated from her grand design would be relegated to the fringes of political discourse, branded as being of the same ilk and in common cause with the whack jobs, the conspiracy theorists, the radical political dissidents, and the tinfoil hat-wearing regressive misanthropes who tacitly aided bigotry, poverty, and whatever other buzzwords carried with them a negative connotation, whatever it took to cut them off from the rest of society. The people openly and vocally begged for her protection, and yet they remained blissfully unaware of her existence, not knowing she slumbered nearby, or that her children walked among them, like a face inside, living right beneath their skin. They felt her presence everywhere, in everything they did, like the spirit of God, and just as invisible, though far less incorporeal. To them, she was but an abstraction, a fanciful ideal that could one day be woven into reality, but whose utopic realizations remained forever just outside their grasp. Had they but known her true monstrous form, they likely would have recoiled instantly in horror, rejecting the nightmarish corruption they'd helped create. Instead, she had worked to ensure her own survival, by carefully spinning a narrative of silken thread to justify her own worth in their eyes. The leaders of the so-called free world were far less free than they realized, being her puppets and mouthpieces, merely serving her bidding, oftentimes against their true will, but always with their tacit consent and approval, for indeed even she couldn't violate the law of the spirit. So instead, she offered them a false choice of trading power for supplication, and almost always they fell for her alluring, artfully woven traps, preferring comfort and security over freedom. Indeed, the people had become so dependent on her, they could scarcely imagine a world in which she was no longer a part, even as she remained forever unknown to them. Such was the stranglehold she had on the public, such was the web of sin they found themselves in, and all the while the foul she-demon preyed upon their naive interests, and their lust for protection from their own inner darkness, their desire to rid themselves of debt and obligation, to be freed of all worldly and spiritual responsibility, to have their sins forgiven without corresponding penance, to have their lives and property safeguarded, their accounts settled, and their insecurities resolved. Even as these teeming masses of spoiled children foisted their own problems onto someone else, she happily accepted them for value, all the while growing stronger as a result of bearing such a heavy burden. One by one she dragged them down to the darkest depths, along an endless cascading spiral of state-sponsored, board-certified, government-approved, publicly sanctioned, taxpayer-funded, never-ending nightmare of nihilistic cyclical consumption. Worst of all, they didn't even know what they had gotten themselves into, and so they could not even begin to fathom a way to escape. Most didn't want to, or if they did, they would never admit to their own contributory negligence and dereliction of duty, their own part in helping to unleash this great and terrible legion of monsters upon the world. Such thoughts were too disturbing to even contemplate. They struggled against it at first, sure, like the hapless sort of flies that they were, but in the end they all grew tired, worn out by a never-ending battle of attrition when faced with a force as powerful as Bureaucracy herself. It was easier to just give in to their viscid prison and surrender, letting her have her way with them as they slowly awaited the sweet embrace of death. Among the more enlightened of her prey, they would often struggle to break free and rouse others to do the same, but her venom would always take hold of them sooner or later. This was a battle that had been waged now for centuries. If she had her way, she would have drained the whole world dry of its energies to feed herself and her children, ruling over them like an empress of hell, and their willful ignorance was the glue which kept the masses trapped within that spider's iron web.